Sorry, does Chair, it is opposition's burden to offend a world in which we erase things like the neglect of children, in which we erase things like sexual abuses that have been committed by those in power. Ultimately, they have to defend a system that has time and time again, and for far too long, protected the powerful because they are celebrities, that has held them to a lower standard because they are celebrities, that has said it's okay to glorify them throughout their life and even in death, and disregard everything that they've done throughout their lives. What do we think whitewashing looks like? We think it means that it's covering up and glossing over things like scandals, vices, any crimes that they've committed. Necessarily, we have to necessarily exclude these things if they want to preserve an image of these individuals as credible, preserve them as idealized and glorified as is being done under status quo. We give you the example of Kobe Bryant, who died in a tragic helicopter crash. However, we do not think about the fact that he chose not to testify in court at the point at which he was accused by sexual assault of a 19-year-old who said that he was engaging in predatory behavior. We don't focus on these things because we necessarily have to focus on the fact that he was perceived to be a good father, or the fact that he was a good NBA player. The alternative that we support under side of government is that we are able to talk about their past in a constructive manner, in a rational manner, which is able to balance out, yes, he was a good basketball player, but at the same time, he was an alleged abuser, and we need to listen to victim stories instead of covering them up. We think oftentimes this has to focus upon the most controversial of cases, upon the most serious of crimes, because it's the only way any side has any impact. If side of opposition wants to talk about small things, like maybe a small feud between celebrities, these things ultimately don't have a large weight upon how they're perceived ultimately after death. We think it has to be those large cases. Into my two arguments. Firstly, why whitewashing is just principally unjust, and secondly, why this cripples rational discussion and policy making. First, why our premise is true, that oftentimes this results in just a total lack of discussion, and oftentimes to the extent of martyring a person. We think that in order to it necessarily prevents this discussion, because you want to commemorate and idealize this person, right? So anything that possibly hints at bad behavior necessarily goes against this idea that you have this person as, oh, they were such a good person, oh, they did so many good things throughout their life. Any harmful narrative that you may have or any rational discussion necessarily goes against that. I think this is extremely impactful and impacts the way people think about these people, because they're easily swayed by media narratives, easily swayed by glorification, and oftentimes you have many diehard fans of these individuals who take offense at the idea that their idol may have been gone against. What does this necessarily mean? I think oftentimes it means that you erase the stories of people who necessarily were victims of these individuals, because recognizing that celebrities often have a propensity to abuse their power because they are in a unique position where they're able to get away with a lot of things. This means that individuals who oftentimes did not get justice in the beginning from things like legal recourse are now re-victimized, they're re-traumatized, because even though society may have bought their narrative from the beginning, now in death you're telling them we don't.
Is it a lag on my part, or is she just
at the point at which they see individuals being glorified?
Is it just me that I can't hear anything?
I can't hear anything either.
Yeah. So I just paused the timer at 3:30. Sorry.
Hi, sorry. Oh my gosh, my Zoom just kicked me out.
It's fine. I just paused your timer, so
Okay,
it's at 3:30. So you're just.
All right, we're not just talking about sexual abusers, but although these are in a lot of very impactful cases, we're also talking about things like robberies in which individuals were actively harmed by these people, right? We think it's principal injustice that we do not want to subject victims to, and we do not want to discourage further victims from coming out because we hold celebrities to a low standard. We say it's okay for them to be glorified, right? We ask government to defend a world in which individuals, celebrities are above the law, are above public opinion, especially because the public court of opinion is often the last safety net for the most vulnerable of individuals to be able to get some solace for their stories. Even if we're talking about a minor scale of things like vices, of things like wrongdoings, in which celebs were, for example, like trapped in pressure, they felt misunderstood, and they often turn to things like drugs or vices, I think that they also cripple these discussions and cripple the centering of these issues, because they chose to whitewash them and chose to throw those issues away. Ultimately, under our side, we get a greater social good because we're able to converse about these things, because we're able to ensure that these individuals finally feel understood, even though they weren't throughout their lives. It's ops' burden to prove why people do not deserve criticism. We challenge them to answer whether this is only in the case of celebrities or whether every dead individual should not have their vices and their crimes talked about at all. Secondly, on why this cripples rational discussion and policies. I think this necessarily removes discourse that is absolutely necessary, right? We're talking about things like issues like abuse of power as a celebrity, in which they're able to utilize a cult of personality to turn public opinion for them and against their victims. We think it's things like justice system advantages, in which the rich and powerful are able to get better lawyers, are able to win court cases. In the case of Kobe Bryant, not even turn up to testify and have that case dropped entirely against him. We're talking about things like Michael Jackson never being charged for the allegations of sexual abuse that he was brought up for. I think opposition never gets any of these discussions about things like sexual assault, things like drug abuse, things like pressures that celebrities face, because they have to preserve a constant image of these individuals being perfect even in death. Why do we get more discourse under our side of the house? We think firstly that people often want to talk about these things. So we're not just talking about victims, but also celebrities that are victims of pressure by the virtue of being a celebrity. I think at the point at which they feel suppressed, at the point at which they feel like they will be harming some sort of legacy that society prioritizes, they're less likely to come out. At the point at which they are able to, under our side of the house, this also leads to borrowed empowerment, in which more individuals feel empowered to step up and talk about these issues. People will also be more open to this because they're more rational, because they're not being swayed by a narrative of glorification. They're able to weigh it out. For example, like we've told you, being able to balance that Kobe perhaps was a good father, but also was an alleged sexual abuser. They're more receptive in these instances. Thirdly, why do we actually get better social change and public policy? I think better discourse necessarily means that you get more social capital. This means that you're able to sway moderates to believe maybe we shouldn't glorify all celebrities. Maybe we shouldn't prioritize a vague idea of respecting a dead individual if we can talk constructively about discussions. It's a belief that celebrities are not infallible. I think this leads to a few things. Firstly, you're more likely to call out existing celebrities because there's less of a perception on a scale that celebrities are infallible. You break that down. There's more likely to be checks and balances against celebrities, not just by public opinion, but also by things like executives that are swayed by this sort of public opinion and likely to put a check and balance on their employees. Secondly, we're talking about things like judicial system reform. So we're able to get that sort of change. But thirdly, executive reform and getting legislative change, because now people who were previously campaigning for this change have less of an obstacle stopping them, and they have more social support. Even if we were talking about small instances, celebrity feuds or social vices, I think it's easier for those celebrities to come up and talk about their experiences if they don't have to live up to a saint-like standard. We've engaged with all scales of the spectrum, the most harmful, in which there are actual victims being victimized, but we don't erase their stories and whitewash those away. But even in small circumstances in which the celebrities themselves were committing small things, we enable there to be discussions, for example, about Amy Winehouse's drug abuse, about how Juice WRLD died of an overdose. These are things that would previously be whitewashed to say he was a good guy, and avoid talking about things that would necessarily be controversial or things that would be perceived to be unpalatable in the public eye. What we get under our side is, firstly, we don't erase stories. We allow the full and true stories of these individuals' lives to be told. But secondly, we're able to help victims, we're able to help celebrities as well. Escape the confines of society that currently hold them to a high standard, to a low standard that was necessarily unfair. Because we believe that celebrities were people too, and they should be held to the same standards. So proud to propose.
All right, thank you for that speech. I'm just gonna do a screen share so that we can all just see the timer.
Can you see the timer, by the way?
Okay. So I'm not the best person to say this, but I really hope that the other judges can just turn on their cameras, because mine's just like in a really pathetic angle. There's no way for me to get this standing. Yep. So it would be better if the other speakers could also just like see the judges. Well. All right. With that said, I invite the next speaker.
Can everybody hear me? Cool. Harper Lee brought discussion of racial discrimination to the classroom. Her work allowed countless to understand how destructive and unfair courts were in their treatment of minority. The fact that she opposed freedom riders and trivialized mental illness should not be allowed to weaken that message. So proud to oppose. In its speech, first to set up what we think whitewashing actually looks like, then some rebuttal, and then our 3 arguments. First, why it's morally abhorrent to attack those who can defend themselves. Secondly, the importance of the works of these celebrities. And thirdly, why whitewashing harms victims even more. But before that, the setup in today's debate. What does whitewashing actually look like? Note that this is a regrets motion, therefore it's retrospective. We are allowed to defend what whitewashing looks like in the status quo. It means that we can focus on the positive matters that Gandhi provided for the world and not on the fact that he might have been a pedophile. It means we can cheer on Kobe Bryant and not focus on the bad things he might have done. So what is then specifically this debate about? We think this debate is not about the most extreme cases, e.g. Epstein or after he dies, Weinstein. 1, because it's not what's happening in the status quo. Secondly, because in those reasons there's extreme evidence. But thirdly, because there's simply not a lot of positive matter to focus on. We don't think that is part of this debate. Secondly, we think that if they are attacked during their life, we can still support that. We're completely fine with the Me Too movement. We think that's extremely good to happen. Thirdly, we think this debate specifically takes place in cases that are morally gray or simply have not enough evidence, so we don't know what has happened exactly. For example, with Michael Jackson, for example, with Charlie Chaplin, but also Gandhi, Picasso, or Martin Luther King. Okay, let's move on to rebuttal. Firstly, on our framing, we tell you the alternative extremely unlikely to happen. Why? Because we think that at the moment you have this narrative of a celebrity who then the world find out did something wrong, he will be attacked. 1, because of the media, who wants to have a sensational story, who uses clickbait, who wants to be the most attractive story, and therefore will push a narrative that it was an extremely bad situation and will demonize this celebrity extremely. But secondly, because there are a lot of strong feelings involved. The fans are angry because they feel like they've been betrayed by the person they adored. We think that reveals a lot of discussion, a lot of anger, a lot of different feelings, and therefore the alternative of proposition extremely unlikely. What is likely is that at the moment you don't whitewash, the entire society will attack that celebrity, but specifically its family, because they're no longer able to hold the celebrity accountable. Secondly, on the victims. I'm going to spend an entire argument on this later, but we think that because the person themselves can defend them, it doesn't necessarily mean the victim always speaks the truth, and therefore you principally are unable to believe that. But thirdly, we think they can still speak out during their life. We totally support the Me Too movement. Lastly, on the idea that celebrity can be checked down. Firstly, note that this happens in the status quo, right? Just social media watches everything a celebrity do. We think there are existing checks and balances in place. But secondly, you can hold them accountable during their life, and therefore we see that you can attack celebrities as well. We don't see how this is exclusive to that celebrities only. First argument, why it's morally abhorrent to attack those who can defend themselves. 3 layers in this argument. Firstly, we have an obligation to let a person defend themselves if we want to punish them. Why? We think attacking through social media or attacking or what happens after you don't whitewash men is a form of punishment, and we think punishment should be just. For example, it's the reason you need to have a lawyer in court. It's the reason defamation is being tried in court. The reason for this is because you can take certain rights away, and therefore you can simply punish them if you don't know what happened. This is, for example, also the reason why you can't dig up graves, even though the person itself is dead. We think attacking without the ability to defend yourself is a disgrace to the memory and the dignity you lose. We think is morally abhorrent to do that. But secondly, we think specifically those cases we're debating about, there is a moral hazard, right? Because it's not clear what happened. Because it's often a long time ago, is the celebrity as dead. Because the circumstances often are vague and there's no clear evidence of what has happened. Therefore, we think it's extremely immoral to attack a certain person who then is unable to defend itself and give their view on the situation. But secondly, we think it was simply a different time. You can't hold certain people to the same standard. For example, Lincoln, who was also extremely racist in his time, should not be held to current standards. Third layer, we think relatives are disproportionately harmed after you don't whitewash them. Why? Because the society feels like they should have known what has happened, because they feel like they love them and therefore they are at fault themselves. But more importantly, they're the only person they can harm, because the person who was directly responsible is dead. Therefore, the relatives, those who are not responsible for the actions committed, are disproportionately harmed. What is the impact of this? This means we can't help that celebrity responsible for the action, and they should not be punished. Second argument, on the importance of the work of these celebrities. We think you can't value the work if whitewashed. Why? First of all, because the entire society looks down on you, is demonizing you, and is exaggerating all these stories on you, even though there's not clear evidence. Secondly, because society guilts every individual person who wants to value their work and who wants to, for example, read a book that's written by someone. But thirdly, you yourself feel an internalized shame because you feel like that writer was a bad person. But note that this work does not always glorify the bad action, right? First, because it's not always about the same topic. For example, Michael Jackson did not sing about pedophilia. Therefore, their work itself doesn't glorify the action. But secondly, I think the art is not the artist, but a combination of certain skill set. Like, you can think racism is bad and still make, you can be a racist and still make a picture without having that as a defining trait. Why does this mean we should not regret whitewashing? We think the impact of the work is far bigger on society as a whole. So sure, the impact on one specific individual might be bigger if you compare a victim directly to one individual in society who wants to look at a piece of art. But as you have millions of people who value the art and who feel like that's their way to escape, who needs to read certain book, who wants to lose themselves in this kind of art, we think the overall impact is way bigger. But secondly, on a political level, we think Gandhi, Lincoln, and Martin Luther King are all part of this debate. They're all people who did things that might be accused of. Gandhi probably was a pedophile. Lincoln was a racist, and Martin Luther King is accused of beating his wife and cheating. We think that without whitewashing, we could not have used their memory for the good they later have done. We think, and then on a societal level, we think they did far more good than it could have done if we hadn't whitewashed them. Third argument, why whitewashing harms victims far more. We think when this bad information comes to light, victims are harmed way more. Two reasons why it's not their voluntary choice and therefore did not consent. First, often they did not come forward themselves. Often it's a journalist who looks into a story, sees something they think is nice, and then comes to the victims and asks them to speak out. But secondly, they often don't see the consequences themselves. They're not prepared to see how society will react. Specifically, a society is also likely to attack the victim itself, and therefore the victim is harmed way more. Why? First of all, because of this attack of society, but secondly, because this celebrity is already dead, it happened a long time ago. Therefore, the victim was able to process this thing, but at the moment this comes back into light, they need to retell their story, relive their horrible moments, and we think that's way, way worse. On our side, we're able to value the work Gandhi did, we're able to value the work Harper Lee did, but we also don't bash on the memory of those who can't defend themselves. For all these reasons, so proud to oppose.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Chair, recognize that we think that the side of recognize that we think that the side of opposition is extremely convenient. They say They say that apparently victims have to relive their trauma, the point at which they have to retell their stories. Recognize that victims will be traumatized in both worlds. Victims have to continuously relive their trauma, but knowing and looking at news articles, for example, which constantly glorify their abusers, which constantly portray their abusers to be wonderful people. In the instance of Kobe Bryant, when his victim had to constantly watch him being glorified on social media, saying that he was a gem and he was a wonderful father. All these things compounded to be extreme trauma for these victims, and we think it's principally unjust to let those victims go through that. I think it's extremely ludicrous for the side of opposition to say victims have to relive their trauma at the point at which they tell their stories. This assumes that victims don't go through that trauma on a day-to-day basis and don't already keep thinking about their past trauma. But recognize every time a victim sees a article, for example, about their abuser or amazing things being said in the media, I think they relive their trauma anyways. It's about which side actually gives them some form or some inkling of justice. Recognize that we don't tell you that we want to erase every single good thing a person done. It's about recognizing that human beings are complex individuals, and as much as we do good things, it's about weighing out the certain mistakes or certain flaws that we have committed. As much as we may be able to commemorate Gandhi's independence fight, it's about recognizing the bad things he may have done and realizing, because recognize in every single one of us, we have our good side and bad side. It's about realizing those complex mechanisms in human beings and not trying to portray a perfection on social media, which we think is extremely detrimental. We think we are still able to commemorate the certain good things and recognize those things, but it's about recognizing the bad side too. So we can still commemorate Mother Teresa for the certain things that she has done, but also realizing her racism, for example, or her elitism. We think that's extremely important because recognize the whitewashing of stories is principally unjustified. The first thing they say, moving on to my responses, the first thing they say is that they're extremely fine with the Me Too movement. So allowing celebrities to be shamed in like real life when they're alive. Recognize that we're structurally proven to you why this is extremely difficult to do. So when celebrities are around, number one, they're able to completely change and sway media narratives to the amount of power they have or the amount of influence they have. They constantly do good things. So constantly donating to charities, for example, constantly mentoring other juniors, for example, constantly uplifting people. So they're able to actively and strategically sway their image away from these things. But secondly, the judicial system itself fails in certain instances. Like in Kobe Bryant's case, the amount of fame he had actively led to him being able to actively being able for him to say that I don't want to testify, and then the case was immediately dropped. This is the amount of power that celebrities have when they're alive, to the point where it's so hard for victims to gain any amount of closure. Even when they're alive, I think the defense mechanisms that opposition wants to talk about are defense mechanisms that actively stamp against the right of victims, and we think actively shame victims for everything that they do. Do you know what these defense mechanisms look like? It looked like celebrities actively saying that victims are, for example, attention seeking. It looks like celebrities actively swaying information and using the media narratives to constantly make fans believe or manipulate fans' reactions. All these things are defense mechanisms that exist, and we think that we are talking about things which are already proven. This looks like Kobe Bryant. Actually, we have evidence to actually prove Kobe Bryant was an abuser, all these things. On our world, we're actually able to garner some form of discussion as to the possibility of abuse and understand that no celebrity is perfect, and we actually hold celebrities to a higher legal standard. The second thing they say was that apparently we will demonize celebrities and fans will be angry, and this means that we can't appreciate the things we do. I've already responded to that by saying that we actually can, and it's actually a good thing, simply because we're able to realize that there's always a good and bad side, and that this is how the media learns to adapt to this, to be able to glorify the things they do, but also criticize the negative things. We think it's a culture we need to adapt to. The third thing they say is that just because they were racist in the past or sexist in the past, they shouldn't be held to the same legal standards. Like, I'm just structurally unsure why this is true. That these are individuals which have all the information that these things are wrong. Kobe Bryant was someone who knew he was wrong and actively tried to defend himself by manipulating media narratives and constantly shaming his victims. We think that these are individuals should be held to the very same legal standards simply because we shouldn't let celebrities get away. The fourth thing they say is that the work itself is different from the artist, and hence millions of people want to appreciate their art. But this is exactly true. We don't say that you can't appreciate their art. Recognize that we are only talking about the whitewashing of the artist itself. So the art can still be enjoyed, etc. We're able to distinguish the art, as how I've said, and the artist. I think people can still appreciate the art. It's just that they need to recognize that the artist has a bad side. But lastly, I think that we're able to actually hold celebrities to a higher standard of justice, which will be my extension. Recognized on their world, celebrities constantly know that when they're alive, they're able to constantly manipulate stories. They're able to constantly shut victims out. This means structurally, celebrities know that they can get away. This looks like more celebrities becoming abusers behind closed doors. This looks like more celebrities adopting racist behavior because it benefits them, but also being able to sway public narratives. The point at which celebrities know that even when they die, the media will constantly side with them. The point at which they know that the public will side with them. This is when we incentivize celebrities to constantly behave badly and constantly not uphold the moral fabric of society and constantly behave in a way that shuns victims. We think that on our world, celebrities know that they will be held to a higher standard. We think on our world, celebrities know that their stories will be dug up. This is when we think celebrities, number one, are structurally held more accountable, but number two, have an incentive to not only hold themselves accountable, but number two, inherently change their behavior, because they know that if they try to shun victims during their lifetime, the dirt will be dug up, and we will not whitewash their stories merely because they're celebrities. This means individuals understand that celebrities are not perfect. This means individuals are more likely to hold them more accountable, listen to victim stories more, not just idolize these individuals and glorify them. What does this lead to? Number one, we think more victims are able to speak out, because recognize the point at which we constantly whitewash stories, and because whitewashing stories also comes side by side with shaming victims. We can't whitewash a story while not saying that the victims are untrue and constantly shunning them and saying that these are attention seekers. The point at which another victim of another abuse sees another victim of that particular celebrity constantly being shunned, we can say create a culture of victim shaming and victims constantly being afraid to speak out. We currently create a society on our world where we know that celebrities are capable of these crimes, that we know that we're able to have discussions on the amount of power celebrities have, because we create the media attention as to how much celebrities have hidden in the past and how much celebrities have swayed in the past. We're able to understand these things as a society and constantly hold celebrities accountable, but this creates a culture where victims are more empowered to speak up. We think victims are far better off on our world, but also we get a culture where celebrities constantly have to understand that they're not perfect, and I think the media changes in and of itself when we don't constantly talk about the perfections of celebrities, but also things that they have done. For example, drug abuse, more people understand these complex mechanisms, and empathy in society grows, but also we hold the strongest of people more accountable. Proud to propose.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Hello. Can everyone hear me? Yes. The Deputy Prime Minister admits that celebrities, like everyone else, are complex individuals. They are good and they are bad, and there are countless gray zones that they enter. But then she attempts to have her cake and eat it too. Because what we tell you is that celebrities are essentially an icon for what they stand for. Martin Luther King is the civil rights movement. He is the March on Selma. The moment where you try to have the good with the bad, that message is instantly watered down. He is no longer the very thing that has made him famous. He suddenly becomes a complex individual, someone that you cannot fully trust, and someone that might not be moral because they have also done immoral things. It is at that moment that the message loses its punch, it loses its value, and we get none of that beneficial effect upon society. In my speech, firstly, about the principle justification, then talking about an impact on society, and lastly, on the value of art. So, firstly, is it principally just to attack dead celebrities? We provide you a very crucial point of context here that I want to reinforce with no response. That often this doesn't happen in a fair and unbiased way, but is often extremely sensationalist, no thank you, and often happens very viciously from the side of the media who tends to be clickbaity and tries to get as much attention as possible. There's not a fair weighing of evidence, but they try to get an accusation and make it as bold as possible to get as many views as possible. This is important when considering how fair these types of attacks really are. Prop tells you two large principled lines. First, they say celebrities are not above the law, they are just like you and me. However, there are two main issues with this principled line. Firstly, we think that we largely apply the same rules to normal people, which is to say it's incredibly taboo to target people who are dead for the same reasons that we say about celebrities. You can't defend yourself, and often there's lots of complexities to immoral behavior that you can't just simplify into a simple line. But even if we did attack normal people, I think there's a crucial difference here, which is to say that normal people are not held to the court of public opinion. We think that for the same reason that we don't hold regular people accountable for crimes that they have done after they are dead in normal courts, we don't think you should hold those people accountable in the court of public opinion either, because it can be just as powerful. It can take away the legacy that for some celebrities is the one thing they have spent their entire time working. It is their main goal in life. And because it is so incredibly destructive, we think it also needs to have the same types of moral regulation to ensure that it is wielded successfully. The second line they bring you is that victims exist and that their rights are violated. Two responses. Firstly, I think this is largely a practical argument about the things that victims care about, and I don't think this is a principled line that justifies why we can suddenly attack people that we do not care about, celebrities who are now dead. But secondly, we told you that practically, often, no thank you, this is a lot better for victims, because at the moment where these celebrities don't get whitewashed, you are forced to relive that moment. And the response you get is victims are always in trauma, so it doesn't matter if that trauma is brought up again. We tell you there's a crucial difference, though. Firstly, we think that things like therapy and a period in your time where you move on exists. It is not like people who are victims of various abuses are literally stuck in that trauma for the rest of their lives. You can constructively work on that and get to a different point in your life. But then at the moment where all the news media is constantly talking about you and all the terrible things that have happened to you, you are then forced to relive that moment far more vividly than if it was happening passively in your head. But secondly, and perhaps more terribly, we think that the moment where these people do come forward and are brought in the mainstream news media, they get attacked by the hardcore fans that have not given up yet. We talk about the victims that are being viciously harassed by fans of Michael Jackson. These people are not reliving it in a nice way of seeing final justice for the things they have done, but they're now scared because of the death threats that they've received from these people. We tell you at the moment that it is brought back into the mainstream, you are forced to relive it and maybe even experience a far more terrible fate, which is being crucified by the people that care so much about these celebrities. On the other hand, we tell you there are two major groups' rights that are violated at the moment where you do try to hold these people accountable for things that happened while they were alive. Firstly, we told you about the celebrities. We told you two large issues that existed when you try to hold these people directly accountable. Firstly, the actions that they committed often exist within a moral gray zone. The only example that Team Proposition provides is Kobe Bryant, but even here we think it's incredibly vague whether or not this actually happened. Besides the victim saying it happened, there is no other evidence, and in a court of law where we apply the normal values of burden upon proving someone did something, it was acquitted and Kobe Bryant was not found guilty of that action. What this means is that it is almost never clear cut. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having this debate. We think that in debates of very black and white, something is completely immoral. We do not whitewash them. The second thing we say is that often things happen within a different time period. Often people that are dead now lived 50 years ago or when they did that immoral thing. And while the proposition says people always have all the information, I don't think that is true. If you were Abraham Lincoln and you grew up in a deeply racist society, he was extremely progressive for his time. It is not his fault that he was still racist in some of his tendencies. I think that context is extremely important when you're weighing moral decisions. The second line we brought to you was that people cannot defend themselves. We tell you that you are not allowed to accuse someone of something in court after you are dead because you need to be able to defend the things that you have done. Because there are moral complexities, you need to explain the context of the situation, and you need to be able to say your side of the story. Otherwise, we are just attacking you from one side, and often extremely sensationalist as well in the media. No response on this principle whatsoever. Secondly, we said another group's rights are violated is the relatives of these targets, the relatives of these celebrities. They become the target of that court of public opinion. And that is entirely unfair because often they're completely unrelated to the crime. We think it is a grave injustice that people that did not commit anything suddenly become the bearers of punishment for that person. We would much rather someone be attacked while they were still alive, because then at least their family does not have to deal with the massive fallout that comes from that. No response on this way off, on this principle either. So let's weigh it off then. Let's say the victims' rights are indeed violated. They are completely right in what they are saying. Why do you think that celebrities are still more important in this way off? We tell you about the presumption of innocence, which is to say that the moment in court, we always have to presume someone is innocent. We therefore defend the alleged perpetrator because you can't just accuse people randomly of things because otherwise everyone could be like accused all the time. But secondly, I think that what the DPM says is true. We hold celebrities to a higher standard, but because of that, when we do accuse a celebrity of doing something immoral, we need to be very much more sure of it because the fallout of that, like being incorrect, is so much greater. What this tells us is that accusing these celebrities like after they're dead is completely immoral. Let's also talk about the practical impacts. Are societies positively influenced by these types of discussions? Because proposition gives two large lines. Firstly, they say the discussion is helpful. What we tell you is, first of all, this discussion can happen while they are still alive, such as we saw with the Me Too movement. But secondly, often these discussions are completely non-constructive, which is to say that because there are so many complexities, and because the people that don't want to change can simply say, well, they're dead and they can't defend themselves, those discussions lead nowhere, and they simply are people attacking themselves and bringing the trauma back to victims with no real change. Then they say celebrities will change behavior when they're held accountable after death. I think that these actions are never rational, they are not weighed off, they are crimes of passion. Therefore, they're not going to change behavior because of some weird impact that could happen after they die, but also they're often egotistical and think that they are the exception to the rule. Weigh the last panel against our impact, that there are countless political activists like Martin Luther King and Gandhi who have done morally ambiguous things. When they can be attacking those immoral things, the people that are their detractors are also going to attack them. Their message is weakened and society is hurt overall. I beg you to oppose.
All right, thank you. Next speaker, please.
Am I audible? All right, thank you. When side opposition came up here and told us victims shouldn't voice out their story because they would relive their trauma, that they shouldn't seek out courts or seek out legal recourse just because it would make them feel worse. We think that has been the very reason why numerous victims of sexual assault, especially at the hands of individuals who abuse their positions of power, are currently left without justice and are currently left without legal recourse. We would say that if we were to trade off the people who find more happiness by virtue of being able to consume music or art that don't come with connotations of guilt, for example, we're happily willing to posit to you, panel, that these individuals don't matter as much as the victims victims who have been left voiceless, as the victims who have been shamed for tarnishing a legend's legacy. We would say we prioritize those victims over whatever art benefit that opposition wants to argue. 3 issues in the speech. Before that, 1 macro response, and this directly takes away the entire op case. Opposition crippled every single benefit they wanted, when they still wanted to support 2 things. A, the criticism of these individuals when they were alive, and B, supporting movements that actively help victims voice out these perspectives, like Me Too. If these mechanisms exist, they cripple all the benefits, such as the benefits of people appreciating Kobe Bryant's basketball skills, liking Michael Jackson's music, or trying to believe fully in Gandhi's message. You get the very same people to feel the guilt you talked about, which you say is bad, and you also say these individuals would therefore be unable to maximize their happiness by virtue of the connotations of guilt that exist through social perceptions. Even if we say that you can have that burden, we would say the conclusion to that is that by virtue of supporting all these alternative mechanisms on opposition, they took on the burden to prioritize victims, to prioritize social change. This debate therefore becomes one that is a comparative about who better helps victims and who better provides a social system that's able to reform problematic structures that for far too long has allowed people in positions of power to abuse their wealth to challenge legal systems. We would say on their side of the house, they have crippled every single benefit and principle on their side. First issue, the principle. Opposition argues that it is morally hazardous was to talk about the controversial criticisms against people because of few reasons. The first claim is that it is morally hazardous because time has passed. I'm sorry, but every single crime that is prosecuted has already been beyond the time in which that crime has been committed. Just because you have a longer frame of time which is passed before a victim decides to voice out their story isn't a moral justification as to why that victim doesn't deserve to seek out legal recourse. If anything, we would say this is one of the most problematic structures within the legal system. For example, statutes of limitations in America that actively prevent victims from even seeking out courts at the point in which they go beyond a certain period of time. This doesn't take into account the perspectives of victims, how they actively need to digest what happened, how they actively need to, for example, live out the experience and talk to individuals to seek help, to seek therapy, and to help have other individuals convince them to seek out courts, for example. We would say all these structural issues with the legal system are only benefits you can claim at the point where discussions actually happen on these problems. Opposition is willing to cripple all those discussions. We say that is principally unjust. The second thing they claim is that it's principally unjust because this individual cannot defend themselves. And they say Kobe Bryant was acquitted in court. I'm sorry. Kobe Bryant was prosecuted in criminal court, but he was acquitted by not even testifying on the stand. He abused loopholes, such as trying to convince the victim that you will be drowned in legal debt if you continue pursuing this case. He abused loopholes like the very statutes of limitations that we have talked about. But moreover, within a civil suit that led from that criminal lawsuit, Kobe Bryant actively had an agreement that silenced the victim from actively voicing out the story. We think these are active forms of moral injustice that society ought to talk about that actually benefits the vast majority of victims and the vast majority of innocent and vulnerable individuals in the long term. Opposition had to come up and compare as to why they would value Kobe Bryant over the victims that he actively silenced. But then the second problem here is that this individual cannot defend themselves. I think the first legal system when he was prosecuted but actively got away from was that mechanism. But moreover, we don't know why this is important because the entire principle there is contingent, for example, on you being able to prove your innocence. But if you can be punished either way because you're dead, we don't see the value of you being able to defend yourself or not. What then does this discussion thereby shift into? We would say discussion outside the house thereby becomes one that acknowledges the good he has done, but not to the extent of opposition that glorifies him. We would say the societal reaction to this would be to acknowledge that Kobe Bryant was a really good and wealthy basketball player. But whenever you have criticisms of like sexual assault case, how he silenced the victim, the discussion then shifts to be more rational. It becomes people talking about how he actively abused that position of power, how he was able to silence victims with wealth. We would say that kind of discussion is actively important in creating structural forms of change opposition did not respond to that came up from first. We would say that's a moral egregious harm that the principal cites clearly on side in this debate. Sure.
Would you send someone to jail even if there was no evidence because a victim told you they harassed or assaulted them?
We think that is the legal process that actively happens. When you have a court case, you accumulate the evidence at the end of the day. The main problem here is whether you allow for individuals to even seek out a court case from the first place. When the victim tried to voice out her story about Kobe Bryant when he was dead, he was actively shamed to say that he was tarnishing a legend's legacy. I think it wasn't just against this specific victim, but the kinds of trickle-down effects will affect all victims as a whole. Maya told this to opposition that we heard no response to. For example, any victim of sexual assault that actively suffered an assault at the hands of a person who has a position of power, or the hands of a person who has a cult of personality, who is famous, is thereby more likely to be afraid of talking out about the issue, of voicing out of the issue, because of fear the demonization opposition never responded to on their side of the house. We will see whether to prioritize these individuals on our side. Second, on the outcomes debate, opposition claims that whenever we don't glorify individuals, we're unable to give them proper appreciation for their work. I think the only examples in which it stands are individuals like Martin Luther King, for example. But for example, I would say that those instances actually ones in which you actually do require active discussion. For example, Gandhi wasn't always peaceful. He did use some form of violent rebellion in the first place. I think if a discussion were to happen in regards to having also that family violence into also accounting for that violent issue, you actually get a more holistic form of holistic discourse that actually takes into account what is thereby the more effective mechanism, or to evaluate, for example, why that was bad, and then therefore no society should ever opt to have Gandhi's violence approach, and should thereby prioritize Gandhi's peaceful approach. I think if you're using such convenient examples, your side of the house doesn't get the benefits anyway, because people, regardless of the shaming or not, are likely going to be rational to rationalize the fact that their social change is something that was highly beneficial to your side of the house. We would say that second, in our worst case scenario, and this is taking opposition at their best, where we can talk about maybe the philanthropy that celebrities have done or the good things they have done, we are happily willing to trade it off. Why? Two reasons. A, more often than not, these good actions are not necessarily done out of goodwill. For example, their good actions were facades to cover up their problematic behavior and actions that actively led to society's dissonance, right? The donations that allowed them to illegitimately shift the attention from their case of sexual assault, for example, to prioritize them as a very benevolent individual is something that we find morally egregious, and society should be able to call out these kinds of problematic acts that actively diminish the value of justice and actually diminish the stories of victims at the end of the day. But second, we would say the benefits we get far protects more victims and individuals on our side of the house in the long term. Because every single time you have a discussion about Kobe Bryant's case or Michael Jackson's case, what you realize is that you recognize a societal problem that is actively ingrained within the current status quo. Individuals who are able to escape the legal system by abusing their wealth and power. We would say when discussions focus on this, you get far more social capital and political capital to change legal structures, to accommodate for these issues, to get proper change within workplaces, to institute things like policies to prevent sexual assault. We would say that on our side of the house, we would rather not glorify individuals who actively committed egregious harms. We would rather prioritize the victims that for far too long have been silenced on side opposition.
All right, thank you. Third up, please.
Can everyone hear me? Panel, the problem with this debate is that there's a lot of uncertainty. We don't know what happened with Kobe Bryant, and we don't know what happened with Michael Jackson. Yet proposition also doesn't know that, but is willing to destroy the art and work that inspires millions every single day just for some marginal practical gain that we can achieve just as easily. I don't think they have a case at this point. In my speech, I'll first clear what this narrative looks like and point out some strategic flaws by the other side, and then weigh off victims versus the principle, and then go back to their work. But first, what does this narrative look like in the real world? I don't think we've ever had a reaction to this. They try to set up this nuanced picture of like, we have constructive talk and discussion, but obviously that's not what it looks like. And we've told you this, but we have no reaction. The reality is that it's likely that the media will viciously attack this, will go about this and be very sensationalist, right? They don't respond to this, but this is the likely comparative, that suddenly magazines are going to plaster all over family and victims. But this is damning for their case, because it disproves their principle, because their principle relies on finally victims being heard. But we don't think that's true, because victims have no influence over the way their story comes forward, right? They just assume it's going to be sympathetic and nice, and they have the side that helps victims. But if we look at the victims of the Weinstein case, they also got dragged by Fox News, even though they were seen as a sympathetic group, simply because you can't control sensationalist media. So don't think that they're the side that helps victims if they just let loose media that has no empathy upon these victims. I think this tackles a large part of their story. But secondly, I think that they don't understand that whitewashing comes from not knowing a full story, right? The majority of whitewash instances is whitewashed because there is no evidence. That's why the mainstream media doesn't whitewash Epstein, because there's hard evidence. No, thank you. So that means that they can't blindly assume that they have evidence for every of the cases, because whitewashing is a symptom of the fact that we don't know the full story. Let's go on. There's just some strategic flaws, because I think two things that they do wrong. First is that they just only base their case on one example that is most advantageous for their side. They only talk about Kobe Bryant, where there is somewhat clear evidence, but that's a unique instance. It's also the most recent one that has caused actual change. This is not representative of the majority at all. Listen to our case. We've given you numerous examples throughout history that they're unwilling to engage with. But secondly, I don't think that they understand that their practical doesn't work. They say this is the only thing that will finally hold celebrities accountable, but obviously that's just not true, and there's no clear link. Examples in the status quo, which is what we defend. Me Too, that has changed the way we structurally look at celebrities and hold them accountable. Because we're fine with holding celebrities accountable when they are alive, when they can defend themselves. We're not fine with Proposition and the rest of the world assuming someone's guilt without giving someone the dignity to talk back and defend themselves. So all their practical outcomes of like, we change the system, we can do just as easily. You don't have to defame a dead person in order to do that. How should this debate be judged? Clearly, Prop tries to win on the practical by reforming the system and helping victims. So we've already won. If we disprove that, what I think we've largely done. But we also win on the principle, and here's where Prop misunderstands the debate. It isn't a practical debate in its entirety. It's also about legitimacy. Can you drag someone's legacy without proof for practical gain? Because in the status quo, we also don't allow defamation to win a defamation case. We sue you for defamation, even if victims don't like that, right? So clearly there's a principled line here that they've ignored. So let's go into that line right now. Can we attack someone who can't defend themselves? And third prop says, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if they can't defend themselves. We think that's morally abhorrent to say, because in the context, there are actions that fall in morally gray areas. They happened a long time ago. We don't know exactly the context because we weren't in the house of Kobe Bryant, right? So Proposition assumes they're all guilty, which is fine to assume if someone is alive and can disprove that, if they bring evidence that they're not guilty and give them a chance to talk. Proposition does the same thing with people who are dead. Just say, they're guilty, without giving them the chance to say back. We say that's principally illegitimate. We say in any form of punishments, legitimacy is important. So we see this as a form of social punishment that needs to be legitimate. The only way to do that is to allow a person to disprove that and to save his reputation, right? For example, you can't sue a dead person in most countries because there's no lawyer that can properly represent them. But also, it's immoral to rob someone's grave simply because the dead person isn't physically there to defend themselves. We all say this is undignifiable, that they just do no thank you. What does it mean? It means that you principally can't vigorously attack them because it's illegitimate. But it means for their case that their victim point doesn't work. Because even if you believe they're the side that helps victims, it doesn't mean it's suddenly legitimate. For the same reason, we don't allow victims to decide the prison sentence of their perpetrator, even if that makes them feel better, because we understand there's a principal line of legitimacy and human dignity that we need to uphold. I don't think Proposition agrees with that. So we think we win on that principle alone. So even if you believe their practical benefits, which I think are marginal and we can achieve better, but if you believe them, that's fine, because you can't overrule the immorality of that act alone. I'll take your POI.
This debate cannot happen in morally grey areas or unproven allegations, because whitewashing necessarily means disregarding the proven bad for the good. Kobe Bryant actively apologized and paid the victim off in a civil lawsuit. You cannot disregard that case.
No, I disagree. Because whitewashing doesn't happen in cases where there's clear evidence, because there's no reason to whitewash them. We whitewash people because we don't know if it's true, so we give them the benefit of the doubt because we love them. That's why we think, look at real life examples. I mean, it's extreme, but we don't whitewash Hitler in most instances because we have clear proof. Same for Epstein, because we think there's clear proof there. The majority of examples, including your prime example of Kobe Bryant, we don't have clear evidence, so we don't think that falls into the debate. But let's move on to our second impact, on the work of artists or celebrities and how that gets lost. We think whitewashing is the only way to protect the art and work of celebrities. So we're willing to give them the benefit of the doubt, given that this is a morally arbitrary thing. They say, we can have our cake and eat it too. They can still have art because we're rational. I don't think they're rational at all, because you can't look the art the same way. At the moment, you can't separate it from the artist, because the artist is all over the news, because his reputation is smeared, because you're shamed by society, and suddenly you feel guilty yourself for liking it. You can't be rational. Listen to the props irrational analysis. They defame Kobe Bryant, even though there's no evidence. So we think irrationality is something that's going to happen. So that means, on that proposition, Gandhi and Martin Luther King cannot be looked at more in the same way, because they all have immoral past and are defamed without having the ability to defend themselves. But we think in some cases, we need to recognize that the work that celebrities have put in changed the fundamentals of society in a beneficial way. That's why this point wins the debate, because there's a huge people who benefit from art that outnumber the people who are marginally harmed by it. So millions of people have read To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee and have their views of racism changed by it and society changed by it, even though she was an immoral person to begin with. The same with Picasso and former artists that might have done immoral things. We say, for this reason, we need to give them the benefit of the doubt at the moment it is. Whitewashing might be the only way to do that in the first place. In the end, they want practical gain, but are willing to go to immoral extents to reach that. I don't think we should stand for that ever, and not today. I'm very proud to oppose.
All right, thank you. Up reply, please.
Can everybody hear me? I'm not going to be able to tell you a very sympathetic story about a victim who now feels like he's heard in society because he's able to let the media know all the horrors that happened to him. I'm not able to do that because we do not know what happened. We weren't in that situation, but more importantly, no one else was. But at the same time, the celebrity's memory, the rights of their relatives are all dragged through the mud, while the work they created, the legacy they left behind, is never able to survive from these attacks. In his speech, firstly, 2 small points on strategic housekeeping, and then a way off between the victims, the principle, and the impact on society. Firstly, what is this debate about? We told you from the start all once that this debate is about morally gray areas, because in the clear cases, we don't whitewash because there's nothing to whitewash, as we directly know what has happened. They can't give us a POI and 3 up to finally address that point. This is a regrets motion. We're able to defend the status quo. This is what we have done from the start. Secondly, note how completely irrelevant the accountability of celebrities argument is from side. Why? Because we defend the status quo, therefore Me Too happened, therefore Time's Up happened, and therefore we're able to say we can hold these celebrities accountable. We told you this throughout the bench. They do not have the analysis to stand on that. But secondly, we told you that due to the social media, these things are brought to light because society does feel for the victim if the celebrity is also able to defend their side. Okay, let's move on to the most important way of in this debate between victims, the principal, and the societal clash. Note how extremely marginal the impact on victims is, right? Because even if we take precise proposition and we tell them, okay, it's good for them if they're able to tell their story, they are attacked. They are forced to relive that story because you are unable to deny that that happened. We can say it might be a bit better for them if they do it, but it's still a harms that proposition has to defend. That means the benefit for these victims is at best marginal because there's still enormous harms on our side of the house. How does this then weigh up against the principle? We told you we should hold everybody to the same rights because we have a duty to treat everybody as an innocent until they are proven guilty. This is the reason why we have courts. This is the reason why defamation is illegal, even though, and therefore we should hold celebrities for that same again also. How does it then weigh up against the victims? We tell you as both rights might have been abused. We do not know which one. However, the celebrities are unable to tell their side of the story, but more importantly, the relatives of these celebrities are harmed as well. How does the relatives and the celebrities and the victims then weigh up together? We tell you the relatives never did anything wrong in their life, but also don't need to have any added harm, right? Something happened or might have happened to victims. We can never change that, but we can prevent further harm happening to relatives. We think we have a greater duty to prevent that. That is the principle we brought you from throughout the bench. Okay, but even if you don't believe that, let's then weigh off the societal impact and the victims. We tell you the work these celebrities have done does more good. Why? Because the harms that has been done or might have been done to those victims can never change, but we can still change how people feel. We can still use Gandhi as example for peace. We can still use Martin Luther King as the face for civil rights. We told you from the start here, it is impossible to do that at the moment you don't whitewash them. Because you're never able to say that Martin Luther King was a great man if the allegations are true. You're never able to say you should follow Gandhi's lead if he was a pedophile, because at that moment you demonize that person. But secondly, we told you music and art itself is a way for individuals to escape society. It's a way to escape trauma. It's a way to escape abuse. Even though on the very individual level, the impact might be smaller, we tell you as there's millions of people who are helped by this art, who feel a way to escape and lighten up their pain, we tell you we should care more about them than we should care about victims who are never able to undo the trauma that has been done to them. For all these reasons, I beg you to oppose.
Thank you. Last speaker, please.
Somewhat of me.
Hi, sorry. Panel, opposition's case that is literally one of a rape apologist and a victim doubter. The kind of narratives that right-wingers use to say, oh, these celebrities who exploited their positions of power are infinitely more important than victims of their abuse. That they know what is best for victims and that victims are always not telling the truth. I think that this was abhorrent starting from their first speaker, but also that was unfounded because all the harms that they told us about, oh, victims will come out and they'll be bashed by the media are reasons why they were true in the first place. But even if they were not, I think they missed out on an entire half of the debate if they only chose to talk about the contentious cases. Because recognize, they took the burden to engage with Kobe. We told you there was substantive evidence that Kobe was an abuser. We tell you, for example, like if they tell us that we've only used one example, that Winston Churchill caused famine in multiple developing countries and is still seen as a war hero. All these individuals were whitewashed under the status quo that they wanted to engage in. They only chose the most convenient context for them, even though they took the burden in the beginning to talk about all of them and then burden shift. They say you weren't in the room when Kobe was abusing someone, but they weren't in the room either when they say that MLK was a child abuser as well, that he beat his kids. How would they be so sure of that if we had it entirely, if in a world where we were able to whitewash these sorts of instances? I don't think that we would. I think it's extremely valuable that we're able to talk about these sorts of abuses and the kinds of people that these celebrities were without entirely glorifying them and covering up these abuses. Three main questions. Firstly, what would this discourse look like in the absence of whitewashing? Secondly, are celebrities, principally, should we just defend them even though they're dead? And thirdly, on victims. Firstly, on discourse, I think the assumption that rabid fans will pop up to attack victims and people who talk about their abusers at the point in which there is no whitewashing is absolutely absurd. We told you from the beginning that they were strengthened by the idea that these individuals were able to be glorified, that they were infallible, and only then were they able to fully idolize this individual. But we never understood, even though they tried to tell us throughout all the speeches, that individuals cannot distinguish the art from the artist. Why are individuals not rational? They gave us no structural analysis to prove that. I think people currently recognize that, yes, people are able to recognize that, yes, Martin Luther King was good for the civil rights movement, but he also did some bad things. We can recognize that Mother Teresa gave a lot of food to the hungry, but she also was kind of racist. These are all things that rational individuals are able to separate within their minds. But furthermore, they said, we protect Me Too. We think these sorts of discourse would be much harder, and they currently are, because you're able to glorify individuals like Harvey Weinstein, because you're able to say that celebrities are above the law, but also above public opinion. We do not stand for that. Secondly, on the issue that celebrities are somehow more defensible than the average individual. Firstly, because they have some sort of social good. Note, panel, that they were extremely convenient. Kobe Bryant played basketball. What sort of social good had that done to the world? But also all the things that people like Martin Luther King had done were already in the past. All those benefits have already been accrued. What exactly outcome are they trying to pursue here? But they told us, oh, being dead means that they're unable to defend themselves. I think firstly, this analysis was contingent upon the bad thing that they did being unproven, which was again, very unengaging. But furthermore, if they want to talk about defamation cases, and third, you actually drop defamation cases when individuals are dead, because necessarily these discussions and discourse that we talked about, being able to recognize that abuses happen, weigh out over the reputation of someone who cannot feel hurt, who cannot feel that there isn't dignity given to him because they're literally dead. They never gave us an actual strong principle as to why this mattered. It was never a burden to defend an attack on relatives, because often these relatives are actually extremely apologetic for the abuses that their relatives have done. Thirdly, on victims, they say they shouldn't come out and talk because they're going to be attacked. By that very virtue, why would they have support things like Me Too under their side of the house? There was a principal contradiction within their case. We support under our side them being able to come out in a world that does not demonize them because we glorify celebrities. We support a world in which they're able to make a choice, unlike side opposition saying we don't defend victims, we choose to protect celebrities, even though they are the ones in positions of power, even though we gave you structural analysis as to why they're always coming out on the upper hand. This was never a policy to demonize every celebrity. It was a policy to counteract a current narrative of glorification and to preserve justice for victims. So proud to propose.
Right, thank you guys for that debate. I think you can just go back to the main room. Servers as well too. I think I'll just ask you to get a separate room for the judges. Yeah, thank you.